Hi, my name is Brandon Hunter-Pazzara. I'm a PhD candidate at Princeton University in the Department of Cultural Anthropology, and I'll be presenting a paper today called Wild Sargasso Sea, Social Labor, Conviviality, and the Future of Unions. And this presentation is based on ethnographic work that I conducted in the town of Blaida Carmen, where I looked at the role that two different labor unions play in the local political economy and the sociocultural dynamics of community life. And for the purposes of this presentation, their role in environmentally unsustainable tourism development practices. And this presentation is a way for me to think through some questions that I still have around the question of what conviviality means, what kind of work is involved in producing convivial social relations, and if it does entail work, what kind of work ethics do we need to imagine, and what kind of collective worker institutions are we going to look to if we really do have to make an effort to live together in some kind of uneasy harmony as a way to survive pending climate catastrophes. And my thinking around the question of conviviality, or as I'm going to put it, solidarity, it really draws inspiration from Emile Durkheim, who I bring into conversation with contemporary critical thought, particularly from the Black feminist tradition. For Durkheim, there are two categories of solidarity: mechanical and organic. When social solidarity is mechanical, individuals recognize themselves through a singular normative order. For this reason, the law that dominates social relations is criminal law, as it becomes necessary to sanction those who deviate from this order. While some interpret mechanical solidarity as a marker of a civilization's development, Black feminist scholarship reveals this negative solidarity in the persistence of white supremacy and the dominance of the market as the sole medium through which normative claims can be made. In Mexico, one encounters a mechanical solidarity through the criminalization of drugs, the ruthlessness of market relations, and as anthropologist Joely Rodriguez observes, the assimilating ideology of mestizaje. Contrasting the mechanical is an organic social order. In this world, the individual comes to see herself as belonging to multiple normative communities with a range of different political demands and implications on the individual, what in our current era is often described as intersectionality. This multiply sided individual for Durkheim is an outcome of the economic interdependence that marks the broader scale of the social division of labor. To sustain such difference, Durkheim theorizes that a restitutive law is necessary, as conflicts between different individuals and social groups across diverse normative orders must be reconciled rather than repressed. This notion of solidarity is predicated on mutual recognition and respect, and an elevated level of material quality in which every member of society has their basic needs met. Durkheim conceives of organic solidarity as an ideal state that society must work to achieve. It is within that struggle to bring organic solidarity into being where I conceptualize a theory of conviviality. Between these ideal types lies an infinite number of permutations, as society's internal fractiousness renders it endlessly other to itself as it grows in density and scale. For Durkheim, the task of social analysis is to make society conscious of injustice. Social science ought to be a science of morality, but one that in Patricia Hill Collins' terms is, quote, critical, and therefore committed to unearthing the counter-hegemonic narratives that might better inform our collective understanding of social problems. Unions, I argue, play an important role in fostering organic solidarity or conviviality. In Playa, however, I found this potential routinely frustrated. And the conclusion of my dissertation now offers several policy solutions that would strengthen unions in Mexico and better the lives of ordinary workers in the tourism sector. First, I argue that unions should adopt what I call intersectional syndicalism and build solidarity through the recognition of the differentiated yet shared interests between workers. This means identifying and addressing the racism, sexism, classism, and other forms of systematized bigotry that members encounter in the workplace and the larger society. Achieving this end requires policies that facilitate more internal democracy, which I argue is less a matter of elections and more about creating the space for workers to air grievances and have their grievances heard. Second, I call for a transnational sectoral bargaining agreement between the United States and Canada, meant to supplement the existing USMCA. And I think more broadly, we need to be thinking about collective labor organizations transnationally and globally, especially if we're going to be thinking about some of the ways we'll be committing to mutual adaptation given the looming climate disasters we're facing. And for me, this means doing away with nationally bound labor law regimes and creating high labor floors across the trade zone and within particular sectors like tourism and hospitality. This would allow service unions across the USMCA zone to create meaningful labor alliances and check the power of transnational hospitality and tourism corporations. And finally, I encourage Mexico to formally end the drug war, make peace with cartels, withdraw from the U.S. and international drug enforcement treaties, and begin a process of decriminalizing and legalizing all narcotics. This would make the lives of ordinary citizens safer, allow drug production and distribution organizations to end clandestine operations, and inaugurate a process of peace building after decades of war. Of course, these policies have no chance of being realized, at least not under current political conditions. Similar to Matil Cordoba's observation that the Yucatan Peninsula is, quote, stuck with tourism, I observe that Mexico, and perhaps the world at large, is similarly stuck with the drug war and elite-driven economic development. These two policies hurt working-class Mexicans and stunt the development of stronger unions. This observation builds on historian Quinn Slobodian's insight that bilateral and multilateral trade pacts, investor dispute treaties, and commercial arbitration agreements have encased the economy from serious national political interference. Those nations that stray from this framework become global pariahs, while those that wish to make even modest structural reforms find themselves handicapped and undermined by this complex legal network. Attempts to build powerful transnational unions are similarly undermined by a rhetoric of labor nationalism driven largely by corporate interest. At a moment when a much more ambitious and worker-driven globalization is necessary, and one that I think is necessary for preventing the worst harms of the climate disaster, Mexico and the world finds itself committed to the same terrible policies. It is in this conceptual space of structural impasse where my thinking about seaweed, climate change, and solidarity began. By the end of the 2010s, Plaenses became concerned that tourism could no longer deliver the kind of prosperity it had achieved over the last 25 years. Tourists kept arriving in droves, but their numbers seemed outpaced by the arrival of thousands of new migrants each month. Playa del Carmen had grown exponentially since the municipality of Solidaridad, where Playa del Carmen is located, was formed in 1993, a political shift that allowed governance over this area of the Caribbean coast that would eventually become the Riviera Maya. In 1995, about 25,000 people lived in the municipality, yet by 2018, officials estimated that more than 300,000 people called Solidaridad home. The early days of tourism development were often remembered as a time of mass migration, endless construction, and a booming tourism economy that brought thousands of people, including once poor indigenous Mayans, out of poverty. By 2015, however, the city felt crowded and chaotic. Low-skilled migrants from southern and central Mexico, many displaced by a precarious economy or the drug war, now competed for what seemed like a dwindling number of good jobs and a shrinking amount of city space. Even as housing construction moved westward to keep up with demand, the outskirts of the city were increasingly the site of an ever-growing number of informal settlements comprised not just of poor and desperate Mexican migrants, but refugees and displaced persons from Central and South America and across the Caribbean. Newer migrants were looked on with suspicion, especially those from urban centers of central and northern Mexico. Longtime residents regularly voiced complaints that the uptick in petty crime and the increase in frequency of shootings between rival gangs was the result of urbanized Mexicans bringing violence and disorder to Playa. In 2016, then presidential candidate Trump moaned about the problems Mexican migrants brought with them to the United States. In an unsurprising, though ironic twist, a similar refrain was echoed by longtime Playa residents against newcomers. Quote, "Southern Mexicans might be poor and rural," stated Hector, a Mayan taxi driver from Yucatan state who lived in Playa since the mid-1990s. but at least we follow the law. His xenophobic and classist sentiment inverted the traditional racist belief that rural and indigenous migrants brought problems to urban Mexico, and instead echoed a sentiment shared among other residents in the Yucatan Peninsula that the malfunction of Mexican urbanism posed a threat to the idyllic life in Playa del Carmen. Playenses had always thought of themselves as a more tranquilo alternative to Cancun, and the Ribera Maya as a more beautiful and orderly surrogate to Mexico's diminished Gold Coast. Now, with crime perceived to be on the rise, residents worry they might become the next Acapulco, a once vibrant tourist destination whose decline was narrated as a tale of crime and corruption, unsustainable growth, and the overexploitation of the city's beaches and local ecosystem. One hot April morning in 2019, I sat in Raimundo's office. Raimundo's one of the cronistas, or historians, local historians of Playa, and I asked him if he thought that tourism would eventually succumb to the problems of crime. "Do you think Playa will become the next Acapulco?" I asked. His answer was quick and blithe. "Probably, but who cares? We were poor before tourism and will probably be poor after. If tourism goes away because of crime, some people will leave to look for work, but those that stay will probably be happier. Besides, the criminals will leave too." I laughed at the response while Raimundo continued, "Anyway, it seems that the Sargasso is doing more damage to the economy than the shootings." Raimundo was correct. The influx of large quantities of sargasso, or sargassum, or seaweed, from the eastern Sargasso Sea into the Caribbean was taking its toll on the economy. While seaweed normally washed along the shores of this part of Mexico during the hurricane season, above-average growths have been reported since the early 2010s. Islands in the eastern Caribbean were the first to fall victim to the Sargasso, but by 2018, large seaweed blooms were reported up and down Mexico's Caribbean coast, causing would-be travelers to cancel their vacation plans. This sent local officials and business leaders into a panic. Scientists hypothesized that the higher quantities of seaweed were due to rising ocean temperatures as a result of climate change, and two, to the effect of agricultural runoff from Brazil's ever-expanding soybean plantations. Playenses had little control over these two forces, and so it was left with the impossible task of trying to remove the sargasso from the beaches and prevent new blooms of sargasso from washing ashore. Despite national and international news outlets reporting on the unstable security situation in Cancun and the Ribera Maya, tourists kept arriving. Vacationers, it seemed, could tolerate a little violent crime, but without the white sandy beaches and turquoise waters to look forward to, many decided to travel elsewhere. Seizing on Raimundo's reference to the Sargasso, I added, "They say that the seaweed's growth is the result of climate change. You know, even if the tourists stop coming, if we don't do anything about climate change, this whole area will be underwater by the next century." Raimundo paused before replying, "True, but I'll be dead by then. But you know, the climate is what destroyed the Mayan Empire too. Nothing is sustainable, and nothing lasts forever." Puzzled, I probed further. "What do you mean? We shouldn't do anything about the climate change?" Raimundo let out a short laugh before replying, "Of course not. We should do everything we can. But does it look like we're doing everything we can?" he added rhetorically. "Read the history of the Mayans," he insisted, before moving over to his bookshelf to hand me two historical accounts of Playa del Carmen and Quintana Roo he had authored. Still unsure of what he meant, I thanked him for the books and left. What did the Mayans have to do with climate change? Extinction anthropologist Juno Salazar reminds us is inherent to life on Earth. Most living organisms that have ever existed have gone extinct. Currently, we are living through a mass extinction attributed largely to the rapacious and unrelenting desire for economic growth that is leading to the destruction of habitats and ecosystems across the world. Soon, scientists estimate our era will see the extinction of more creatures than the KT event. This is the extinction that ended the Cretaceous period 66 million years ago, and is more popularly understood as the moment when a 10 to 15 kilometer meteor crashed onto Earth just off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. The violence of the event is unfathomable. The meteor shot so much debris into the atmosphere that as it descended to Earth, it caused the entire planet's temperature to rise to a level that killed off most large land animals within the first hour. As the debris fell into the ocean, the water's acidity became inhospitable to most creatures. A large cloud of dust encircled the planet for much longer, preventing most plant life from being able to photosynthesize. Scientists estimate that 80% of all living things on Earth died as a result of this event. Despite its enormous destruction, the KT extinction is actually only the third most significant extinction event in Earth's history. Humans are an evolutionary product of that extinction event. For most of our existence, we have lived at the mercy of the planet. It is only in the last 11,700 years that humans have been capable of reshaping Earth's geography and climate. Known as the Holocene, though more popularly called the Anthropocene, it corresponds to a period of relatively stable geological and climate activity that has led to immense human flourishing. Long before the emergence of capitalism, archaeologists and paleontologists paint a rich empirical record of humans drastically altering their environments, sometimes at their own peril. While it is common to associate such activities with the civilizations of Europe and Asia, newer research demonstrates how pre-Columbian civilizations managed rainforests, rerouted rivers, and hunted creatures to extinction. The Mayan civilization is part of that record. This is what Raimundo was referring to. While earlier evidence of the Mayas date to around 2400 BC, the rise and collapse of the classic Mayan civilization occurs roughly between 800 and 1100 AD. Early theories attempting to explore the collapse describe the Mayans as victims of a random climate event. But around 40 years ago, Mayan scholars determined that the collapse was a result of, quote, complex systems interactions. By this, scholars mean that the collapse was not just the outcome of a surprise change in the climate, but reflected a more dynamic interaction between the climate and the Mayan civilization's social, economic, and agricultural activities. A 2012 article by Turner and Sabloff add detail to this story. They note the uniquely difficult ecology of the Yucatan Peninsula. The soil quality is poor compared to other parts of Mexico, drought is seasonal and can last for years, and the landscape is regularly thrashed by hurricanes. The fact humans decided to settle in this region is surprising, yet as the authors note, this would not be possible without the ingenuity and knowledge the Mayans developed over time. Innovative agricultural and land management systems allowed the Mayans to expand across the lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula and form large city-states such as Tikal and Calakmul, with populations well over 50,000 inhabitants. We know this period as a time of Mayan astrology, complex cosmological theorizations and writing, advanced mathematics, and large and impressive monuments that today rise above the lowland forests. But as Turner and Sabloff described, the immense wealth also represented a highly stratified society, directed largely by elite interests. Large amounts of labor were mobilized across the Mayan territory to sustain the civilization's growth. To produce the heat needed to make lime for the stone structures, the Mayans clear-cut much of the usable wood across their territory. The cleared land then became used for farming to support the civilization's growing population, but this came at the cost of soil erosion. While the record shows that the Mayans had previously weathered periodic droughts through innovative adaptation, by the 800s these techniques could no longer be deployed effectively. Scarcity generated intercity conflict, while the authors also speculate that it produced interclass conflict as well. The collapse was uneven as some city-states, like Chichen Itza, continued. Even so, estimates suggest that the Mayans witnessed a population loss of about 90%, a likely combination of starvation and migration. When the Spanish arrived nearly 500 years later, much of the forest that had recovered, but the population of Mayans residing in the Yucatan Peninsula was still a fraction of its height. For Turner and Sabloff, the important lesson to take away from this story is that social and economic factors exacerbated the effects of the climate shift that brought nearly a century of intense and regular drought to the peninsula. The Mayans possessed the technology to avoid this outcome, and yet their elite-driven civilization seems to have thwarted any serious attempt to change course. The analog to the contemporary is not lost on the authors. An obvious lesson about climate change and environmental sustainability is present. And yet, what if the lesson here is not that we can avoid a climate catastrophe, but something more demoralizing? That even when we know better, there is always the risk we find ourselves trapped in a political economy we cannot easily reverse course from. On a hot March morning in Playa del Carmen, Mexico, me and several members of the taxi union spent 4 hours shoveling seaweed into large piles that were carried away by dump trucks. None of us were paid. Not even lunch, my friend Miguel quipped. In 2019, the Sargasso quantities were especially high. From a rooftop, one could see huge brown blobs of plant material covering the sea between Cozumel and Playa. As the plant washed ashore and dried in the tropical heat, sulfur content was released, producing a rotten egg smell that drove away beachgoers. The blooms became so large they were impossible to remove. The city of Playa hired dozens of workers, but the quantities of seaweed proved too difficult to control, and with just a small number of city employees. In response, the mayor called the residents of Playa to help out. That's how the taxi union got involved, mobilizing its members and one anthropologist to join in the cleanup. At first, motivating the residents of Playa to volunteer their time proved easy. If the seaweed stayed, the tourists would leave, so a collective sense of solidarity grounded in the city's economic survival spurred hundreds of local residents into action. Since the seaweed was now arriving during the winter high season, residents felt it especially imperative to do something about the problem. Every morning for about a month, one could find dozens of volunteers scattered up and down the beach, desperately trying to remove the impossible quantities of seaweed before the afternoon crowds of beachgoers arrived. But this soon changed. I stopped coming after 3 weeks. Miguel stopped helping after 2. The work was hard, exhausting, and ultimately futile. Since none of us were paid, the incentive to continue helping was low. The mayor's office put out a press release thanking the volunteers. The job, however, proved thankless. A large dispenser of ice water kept us cool, but no lunch, no snacks, ni cerveza, the drivers joked. Despite gobs of sunblock, my pigmentless skin burned. Large mounds of seaweed soon accumulated on the beaches as the city struggled to find a place suitable to store the plant material. It did not have the transportation available to move piles off the beach quickly enough, nor did it have a designated spot for the smelly Sargasso. One solution was to place the seaweed in empty lots owned by the city, though soon all of Playa, and not just the beach, began to smell terribly. Residents in poor areas of Playa accused the city of putting more seaweed in their neighborhoods rather than the rich areas, heightening class tensions. Private resorts took matters into their own hands, hiring hundreds of new staff to help clean their beaches. These workers were paid low wages and placed on temporary and modified contracts that excluded them from union representation. If the problem was really so urgent, I often heard my working-class interlocutors ponder, then why were the economic incentives absent? Why did it seem like the problem was generating more exploitation rather than new opportunities for work? The social tensions that emerged from the Sargasso emergency generated a palpable feeling of resentment among locals. The federal government dragged its feet offering support. The new left-of-center Obrador administration claimed tourism was not a necessity, even though the vast majority of Quintana Roo's 2.5 million residents relied on it for survival. After pressure from the business community, relief finally arrived, though many felt it was too little and too late. Much of the high season had been ruined by the Sargasso, and by the early summer, the start of hurricane season would bring more seaweed to the region, potentially causing further disruption. During the summer, workers continued to harbor negative feelings towards the rest of the country. The federal government's inattentiveness to their plight and their incompetence in delivering relief raised old questions about whether this part of Mexico needed to be part of Mexico. While in the past the feeling of secession was rooted in indigenous resistance to nationalist Mexican colonialism, this new feeling of secession was akin to other regional separatist movements found across the world. Quintana Roo generates more income for the federal government than it receives, my interlocutors regularly reminded me. So why was it being treated as though it did not matter? Resentment soon led to conflict. In the summer of 2019, videos posted on YouTube showed security guards physically removing Mexican and foreign tourists who set up in front of beach clubs. In Mexico, the beaches are public property. This is often a source of Mexican nationalist pride and is routinely cited by anthropologists who criticize the quasi-privatization of Mexican beaches as a result of tourism development. A controversy erupted over national loyalties. Mexicans from the interior of the country claimed ownership of the beaches and asserted their right to sunbathe wherever they liked and without having to tip a local. On the other side of the debate, locals responded, If Mexico's beaches are public, why didn't you help us clean them? From their perspective, the foreigners who paid for beach club memberships and tipped in dollars were more useful to them than their fellow countrymen, who used nationalist rhetoric simply to avoid spending money. Reflecting on the experience, a number of issues stand out. The first is that the tension between the growth in Sargasso and the growth in tourism. Warming ocean waters caused by CO2 accumulation generated this problem, and yet it was only a problem because Playa del Carmen relies on foreign visitors to come and enjoy the beaches. Second, in an effort to clean the beaches, the city first deployed a language of solidarity, similar to the aspirational calls now commonly heard when talking about climate change. But even while it was obvious that Playa's economic health relied on the mobilization efforts from locals, this sense of interdependence and shared struggle was not enough. Indeed, as the crisis wore on, divisions only grew over time. This was not just the case between Quintana Roo and the rest of Mexico, but among locals too. Class resentment intensified as both the city and the resorts offered too little in economic compensation and too little in recognition to keep workers satisfied. Dealing with the excess seaweed also became a source of community tension, as the question of who should bear the cost of having to live next to the piles of Sargasso offered no easy answers. At each social scale, the Sargasso crisis did not produce alignment and coordination, but only division. Divisions that even today remain on the minds of locals. Many of those divisions were rooted in older social and political tensions, whether it be the class conflicts that shaped social dynamics in Playa, or the historically rooted and racialized tensions between the southeast of Mexico and its majority indigenous inhabitants, and the mestizo-controlled national government. It suggests that the daunting challenge of climate change will not erase social tensions, but instead is likely to heighten them without serious effort to address those fissures. I think this is, at this point, a well-established claim that climate change poses the potential to exacerbate conflicts between people, and so we need to have some kind of solution to deal with those conflicts. In this way, the global climate crisis presents us with a new and paradoxical challenge that requires us to rethink the meaning of conviviality. Climate change is the result of an accelerated, interconnected global economy. Yet, it is that same interconnected order and the infinite normative communities that comprise it that holds the key to our survival. Penny Howard's ethnography of Scottish fishermen wrestles with this tension. A globalized seafood market generates incredible downward pressure on her interlocutors to overfish and even practice dangerous fishing techniques. Yet, restrictions on their ability to enter this market, whether through fishing regulations or cuts to subsidies, also threatens their livelihood. There is no easy answer to their predicament, only perhaps a process from which a just solution can be negotiated. For Howard, the billions of people on this planet who earn a living from a globally integrated economy must be included in climate change decision-making. Their knowledge and ways of life are meaningful and important, even if their relationship to nature is functional, extractive, and exploitative. Anthropology, Howard notes, has tended to ignore and dismiss those who make a living from ecological extraction, representing their lives and knowledge as either complicit in unsustainable capitalist relations or subordinate to other more idealized forms of knowledge. The politics underlying this dynamic, I argue, has the potential to alienate workers and redraw new class relations that run the risk of undermining any hope we might have of crafting just solutions to the numerous environmental crises we find ourselves facing. To confront this challenge seriously, I argue, means rethinking the future of work. That means rethinking the idea that there will be less work to do in the future. I think instead there'll be a lot more. Adapting to the climate crisis will require an unprecedented mobilization of labor, but how that labor will be used and under what conditions workers will labor remains an open question. It is possible that droves of workers will find themselves shoveling seaweed or building seawalls to protect the interest of a rarefied elite. Perhaps what awaits is a dystopic future in which large swaths of the population are assigned the task of policing borders and stopping climate refugees. Similar to the Mayan workers who cut down entire forests to feed the insatiable appetite of their own elite class, humanity might work itself into irreparable catastrophe. And although I feel like this might be the path that we choose, I want to hope for something different.